It is important to understand that the Concord of Worlds was not a moral institution. It was not built to be good or evil, but to endure. Our charters used the word continuity so often the parchment looked water-worn. Across ages, the Concord gathered rituals the way a coastline gathers shells, layer upon layer, until the shape of it held fast against the tides of history. Among those rituals was one both ancient and curious. When a new species joined the Concord, it had to choose a name, an epithet to declare its character. The rite dated to a time when translation was more art than science, and an epithet gave the rest of us a fixed point. Names stabilized diplomacy. Names warned the foolish. Names made it easier to draft laws that could last beyond a generation. I keep the ledgers for these rites. I, Rix of the archivist caste, have inked 1,000 names in careful strokes. The spindly Luthari name themselves those who build. Their latticework stations still drift like woven glass along the helix run. The caravanning roan name themselves those who wander in strength. They solved wars with markets. The hive minds of Sorn chose those who are one. Their speaker bodies stood shoulder to shoulder and spoke with one voice. The logic was simple. A name was a promise, and a promise was a pattern that others could learn. When humanity arrived, their name did not fit our patterns. They came late, on a cluster of burnished ships that smelled of oil and ozone even through station filters. Their ambassador was a compact woman with steady eyes, and a jacket that had been mended by neat hands. She listened, and she smiled, and she asked more questions than most. The assembly gave them the usual preface about epithets. We offered examples. We warned them that names cast longer shadows than living bodies. After only a few cycles, the Terran delegation took the dais. The hall under the Dome of Wills hummed with the whisper of climate systems and the rustle of robes. Their translator chimed on, soft and precise. The ambassador set her hands on the rail and spoke. "Call us those who run." It was as if someone had dropped a ribbon into a still lake. The ripples spread and became laughter in corners where protocol could not reach. Those who run. The phrase tasted of panic, of flight, of exposed backs and lost banners. In a chamber of states that prized permanence, the name sounded like an apology for existing. What kind of people named themselves for motion without direction? What kind of promise was that? In the early years, humanity seemed to wear the name as if it were fitted to their shoulders. Humanity was diplomatic to a fault. The Terrans were cautious. They were deferential. They asked for trade routes rather than borders. They requested joint patrols where others would have rattled sabers. When pressed, they yielded ground. When provoked, they withdrew. They made many friends and few allies. And to those of us who counted such things, the pattern looked like acquiescence dressed up as strategy. "Those who run," the delegates whispered in gallery alcoves. How fitting. I wrote the words in my ledger and left space, as I always do, for the footnotes that time inevitably adds. Then came the Skrae. You will find the Skrae in the ledgers under 2 titles. They name themselves in our tongue as those who hunt. In their own language, the epithet meant something closer to the blade that moves. They were apex predators in the most literal sense, raptorial bodies honed by gravity and lean atmosphere, eyes like polished ink, gait like drawn wire. Their fleets struck like lightning, their politics cut like knives. The Skrae were old, their laurels edged. They had bled the outer arms in wars we now teach as cautionary verse. They were also the ones who invoke the Caral. The Caral is a ritual of isolation. It predates engines. It demands that grievances between 2 member races be resolved without outside aid. No proxies, no mercenaries, no sympathetic fleets loitering just beyond the line. It is the most elegant trap the Concord ever formalized. The Skrae called it with exemplary procedure. Their lawyers produced incidents and affidavits. On parchment and precedent, they were the injured party. In truth, they were laying the bait. The first strike fell upon the human colony of Arcadia. Arcadia was a green world, set like an emerald in a silver orbit. Its forests held tall, slow rain with the patience of ancient places. Its seas were shallow and gentle, like a breath drawn through teeth. It was the jewel of humanity's early expansion, less for its resources than for the hope it represented. Children there grew up speaking 3 languages at the schoolyard fence. The Skrae came with a hunter's certainty. Their opening salvo turned the orbital docks into petals of drifting metal. They raced their shadows down to the cities and wrote fire on the ground in straight lines. The forests burned. The seas seethed. The glasswork towers the Luthari had gifted to Arcadia collapsed in ripples like an old tapestry pulled apart. The Skrae made no slaves. They took no spoils. They left only ruin and a transmission that reached every public channel. "Run, little prey," the message hissed. "Run, and we will make a sport of you." As recorded in the Concord's own strictures, the Caral sealed our hands. To intervene would have broken a rule older than our treaties. We watched. There are moments when history is heavier than a mountain in the chest. That was such a moment. Humanity answered. It did not begin with a trumpet call. It began with 1,000 small decisions. Merchant captains welded armor plates over their holds. Miners retooled their drills and called them weapons. Engineers wrote directives that turned automated harvesters into walking shields. Dock workers practiced in cargo bays with cut-down rifles until their shoulders were bruised and their stances were sure. A cluster of small nations on old Earth fell into a single line without being told. Lines of supply thickened like ligaments under skin. Fear changed shape and hardened into fury. Where they had once yielded, they now pursued. Where they had once withdrawn, they advanced by compass points and stubborn arithmetic. They did not match the Skrae for speed, but they matched them for stubbornness, and then they exceeded them. I wondered then whether endurance and pursuit were ever the same thing, or only looked alike when seen from a long way off. Human fleets did not strike swiftly. They struck deliberately. They mapped the math of Skrae raids, set decoys where a predator would pivot, and laced empty systems with sensor threads named for old rivers. Engineers ran ahead to unlock gates and wake way stations. When they retook an outpost, they mended the pumps, stocked a cache, left a note, and moved on. They refused the theater of clean kills. They mirrored each ploy, then tilted the angle a degree until it cut the other way, starving hunting packs not with duels, but by pinching the thin tendrils of supply. Where the Skrae cut, the Terrans stitched. Where the Skrae ran, the Terrans wore grooves. On the Senate floor, under the 1,000 eyes of the dome, the Terran ambassador returned to the dais and asked for a new reading of the Caral. Her name was Reyes. I remember that because her voice was the sort that makes a scribe sit up straighter without knowing why. "Caral," she said. "The blade cuts both ways." Several delegations laughed again, because habit is a fierce teacher. The Skrae envoy, High Talon Keth of the 5th Plumage, tilted his head in the way his people do when they scent a trap they believe they can spring first. Reyes did not smile. She laid a square of cloth on the rail. It had been part of a child's flag, the sort waved at parades. The fabric was scorched, but the painted star was still bright. "The Caral binds us to isolation," she said. "Not submission. We ask only that you enforce what you have already declared." I recorded the vote. It was procedural, precise, and in no way prepared any of us for the war that followed. By the calendars I kept, the war that followed ran 4 conquered cycles, just under 5 Terran years, from Arcadia's burning to the dismantling of the Skrae academies. From reports I reviewed and depositions I copied by hand, the Skrae were offended by the pace. They were used to stunning arrivals and decisive withdrawals, to the sharp theater of a clean kill. Humanity refused to perform on that stage. The Terrans answered each Skrae ploy by mirroring it, then adjusting the angle by a degree until the trick began to work in their favor. They starved the Skrae's hunting packs of fuel and spare parts by targeting not the flashy ships, but the tendrils of supply that fed them. On every world the Skrae abandoned, humanity landed canvases and temporary roofs. They lifted survivors first. Then they repaired air, water, and heat. They gathered, buried, and named. They marked ruined places with small plaques and bars of script no more than a hand high. It would have been simpler to leave deserts behind and call them victory, but simplicity was not the victory they wanted. The last of the Skrae royals, Prince Saren, though prince is a rough translation, made his stand on a forbidden world where no technology could survive. Its ancient atmosphere fouled catalysts. Its magnetic storms hesitated, then struck like a change of mind. The planet was named Asher in an old chart. The Skrae maps labeled it with a symbol that meant place of forgetting. Saren fled there with a dozen of his closest hunters. The Skrae believed in omens. This one must have felt like sanctuary. He believed himself safe until a human dropship punched through a storm stack and came down hard enough to strike a crater into a plain of fused gravel. I note this for the record. The dropship's catalytic stage choked on entry, but its inertial mass drivers and ablative shields required no active catalyst to function. The powered burn failed. The ballistic descent did not. Lieutenant Mara Alien rode heat and math, not thrust, and she landed hard enough to crack a plain of fused gravel, alive, with nothing that needed a spark. The pilot's name was Mara Alien, though in the songs that came later she had no rank, and her name was a sound like air drawn between teeth. She had walked 100 deserts. She had run in gravity and against wind that tried to push her back into the sky. She had lost a sister on Arcadia, and a cousin on a convoy that never made it past the Helix Run. Her file, as recorded, said she volunteered for Asher the moment the mission profile came across her console. On Asher, engines failed, but bodies did not. Saren ran, and Mara followed. They were two figures in a world big enough to forget them, and yet their chase wrote a line across it, the way a finger draws a path through dust on an old shelf. They crossed plains that never saw a tree. They used the arcs of stars to measure distance. They drank from shallow, bitter pans of water and learned the taste of each. The Skrae prince was fast. The human pilot was patient. Patience matters more when the horizon keeps lying to you about how far it is. The pursuit lasted 2 conquered cycles, a little over 2 Terran years, a span long enough to devour a desk man's spirit, if he had not been taught by ledgers to breathe. Saren shed companions like a pack animal dropping gear. Some fell behind and dug in. Mara marked their positions on a scrap of hull she wore at her wrist, and returned later, alone, to bind their hands and tell them a quiet story about the ones who would come to fetch them. She kept moving. She learned the habits of the storms. She learned to cache food under stones that felt warmer than their neighbors at dusk. She learned what Skrae footprints looked like when the prince was limping and when he was not. On the last stretch, Saren found a canyon that cut the plain like a knife wound through a stretched hide. He believed cliffs could do what time had not. He went down into cool shadow and ran along a floor soft with sifted grit. Mara did not go down. She ran above him. She waited for the moment when distance cheated perspective, and then she stepped off. She landed not with elegance, but with accuracy. The two struck the ground together. His talons found her sleeve and scored fabric. Her knife kissed his shoulder and stopped when he froze. It was a touch filled with weight. He had run out of space to run. Saren was a prince of a proud people. He had begun sentences with "we" his entire life. He had given orders without considering whether obedience could be a choice. On that floor of shadow, dust rose in slow sheets and fell again. "End it," he rasped, voice rough with air that had scraped too many throats. "Claim the head and the story with it." Mara's answer was a breath first, then words. "No," she said. "You live. You face what you did." She bound his hands not like a butcher, but like a medic. Then she walked him back across the plain they had carved with their passage. The storms paused at the edges of the horizon as if listening. When they reached the place where metal could breathe again, and engines remembered what they were for, she sent a message in a simple code. It said, "Package retrieved. Prepare the work." The war ended soon after. The Skrae were not slaughtered. Their royal line was captured, not slain. Their fleets were taken apart like dangerous toys, and their parts catalogued for kinder uses. Their academies were emptied and then refilled with teachers who began lessons with ethics before weapons maintenance. Their worlds were not sown with salt. Humanity set up clinics and clean water and the sturdy scaffolding of a basic civil apparatus. They drew up lists of the missing and worked them until the names found answers. There were schedules. There were deliveries. There were ledgers that filled and were checked by hands that had learned to make marks with care. I signed off on more repair permits than births that year. Their vengeance was measured, deliberate, absolute. There were no grand speeches in the dome during those months. I observed awe in our chambers, and fear in the way votes were delayed half a breath. We had believed the Caral could contain fury by isolating it. We had forgotten that isolation can sharpen resolve. I spoke to Ambassador Reyes in that aftermath. The dome had been hung with banners to celebrate the end of hostilities, though the fabric looked shy of color next to the sheaves of manifests and the stacks of repair permits. On some days, the air under the dome still carried a trace of Arcadia's forests, a green note in the filters that made clerks look up without knowing why. I found Reyes in a side hall where a shelf of old treaties kept dust like a respectable cloak. We had both aged in the span the war took from us. "You call yourselves those who run," I said. A curious choice for a people who refuse to stop. She smiled, but only with one corner of her mouth. It was the kind of expression humans use when they know a joke and the weight behind it. "A mistranslation, archivist," she said. I glanced at the ledger beneath my arm. I had written her epithet myself with a new quill and careful strokes. "It reads as flight," I said. "It reads as evasion. The conquered took it for humility." Reyes shook her head. "It's not those who run," she said. "Not like that." She let the quiet stretch, then shortened it cleanly. "It's those who chase." I have spent a life tightening sentences until they fit where they need to go. I will tell you that something in the architecture of the dome changed when I understood her. Not drastically. Not so that visitors would feel unsafe or look up and wonder whether the struts were sound. But the place that held our names made room for what that name meant. Those who chase. Those who run with intent. Those who shoulder a promise and pursue its end until the end is willing to be caught. I do not decorate the record. The ledger is not the place for lace. But sometimes, in the margins of the page where humanity's epithet sits, my hand writes the other names they earned in those years. The patient, the stubborn, the builders of bridges where others set traps, the ones who reverse rituals without breaking them. The conquered endures because we layer law on law until even storms get tired of trying to peel them off. But endurance is not the only way to survive an age. I have seen a new pattern now, written by a species that came to us late, with a mend in a jacket sleeve, and a name that sounded like a joke until it did not. They promised to chase, not to conquer, or to feed or to burn, but to pursue a thing until it comes right. There is fear in that. Yes, there is awe. There is a ledger line that lengthens with each small repair and each hand lifted from a ruined street. There is a prince alive in a cell with bright air and a timetable he can read himself. There are arcs of stars above Asher that remember a line carved by two small bodies running. When I write the title now, I use the Terran script first. The strokes are harsh at the beginning and soften near the end. I keep the Concord translation beside it, for the sake of those who still need to read in our own words. Those who chase. The letters look like edges learning they are also paths.